Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to begin with telling you a short story. A number of years ago, I was in Zimbabwe in southern Africa as part of an Amnesty International team that was investigating abuses there. Zimbabwe had, for a long time, been a country of great promise, but by then had become mired in high levels of violence and terrible human rights violations. And amongst those at greatest risk were the country's human rights activists, those whose only crime was to actually speak out publicly and insist that human rights be protected. During the mission, I met a remarkable woman named Viola, who was one of those activists, and she and her family had paid a terrible price. Her husband had been abducted and tortured for a number of days. She herself had been threatened and chased and beaten. And by now, she, her husband, and their 2 teenage sons were living in hiding. And in the face of all of that, I asked Viola, where do you find the resolve and the determination to continue with your human rights advocacy? And her answer, very heartfelt, was a simple one. She said, if I don't take a stand for my own human rights, do they matter? And if I don't speak out about the rights of other Zimbabweans, how can I ever expect them to speak out about mine? Well, Viola's words I want to share with you say to us something very powerful about the essential relationship between a concept of full citizenship and human rights. In fact, I'd say to you that the relationship between those two concepts is absolutely key, because full citizenship has to be all about taking human rights seriously, in fact, putting human rights at the very center of our lives. And the contrary is true as well. In fact, if we disregard human rights, that becomes the epitome of empty citizenship. And I'm not talking about citizenship in a limited sense of voting in elections and carrying a particular passport. I'm talking about a much richer concept of what it is to be a truly engaged global citizen, to truly live as a member of the human family. And I'm also not talking to you about human rights in a very limited manner. This isn't simply about being read your rights if you're arrested, or having the ability to go to court if you feel you've suffered discrimination. Again, the concept of human rights here I want to share with you is a much more robust and rich one. This is about being able to live your life in complete dignity, in total safety, with a true sense of integrity, and to be able to do so equal to all other humans. When we think about this relationship between full citizenship and human rights, I guess these days we need look no further than the remarkable events that have washed across North Africa and the Middle East over the past 15 months. Millions of people have gathered in public squares like Cairo's iconic Tahrir or Liberation Square. Countless people have marched through streets, they've threaded their way through alleyways, they've strode across bridges, in villages, in towns, in cities, right from Morocco all the way to Iran. Others have blogged and tweeted and flickered and uploaded and shared on virtually every social media site available, all with one aim: to insist that the years, in fact, the many decades of brutal repression now give way to democracy and freedom, and to insist upon, to claim the human rights that never should have been taken away from them in the first place. What it has been a cry for full citizenship. And the results have been historic. In fact, in some countries, stunning. In Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, who would have ever imagined that well-entrenched, strongmen presidents like Mubarak, Ben Ali, Gaddafi, who had presided over cruelty and deep, widespread poverty in their countries for decades, and who I'm sure imagined they had many more years to go until retirement, would be toppled. The transition in those countries, of course, is now so crucial. Will the liberty and freedom that fueled those revolutions truly be delivered, and will it be lasting? Will it be sustainable? Will citizenship become full and no longer empty? In other countries, it's been more elusive. In Bahrain and Yemen, for instance, authorities have given a little and they've taken a little. They've certainly taken some steps to try to appease the protesters, but at the same time, it's very clear they're wanting to do everything they can to hold on to as much power as they can. And then Syria, where it's become so deadly, where so many brave Syrian women and men and young people have marched through the streets insisting that these 40 years of the al-Assad father and son presidents and all of the cruelty of that time now end and give way to democracy. But at such cost. Close to 10,000, perhaps, Syrians have now been killed. The UN stands paralyzed as Russia and China unconscionably stand with the Syrian government rather than the people of Syria. But still, the protests go on, and the remarkable courage of Syrians simply does not abate. In other parts of the region, I think of Iran, for instance, the protest movements were really stamped out before they could even begin, and instead, in Iran, at least in these last few months, that country's execution chambers have been busier than ever, at times averaging 2 to 3 executions a day. But even then, Iranians, brave Iranians in Iran and certainly outside Iran, continue to look for all openings possible to speak out, to get issues in front of their fellow country folk and in front of the world, because these are dreams that simply will not be denied. So what are the lessons of all of that? There are certainly many lessons, but I would say to you that perhaps one amongst all others is that human rights cannot and will not be kept down, and that full citizenship has to, at its very heart, be about living your life in full enjoyment of human rights, but also in taking the steps, in being willing to take a stand and speak out about human rights. It goes back a long time, but certainly we can go back 60 years to 1945 when the United Nations was founded. It was a blood-soaked time in human history. But world leaders who gathered at that time knew that if we were going to advance, human rights had to be at the very center. And we see it in the eloquent opening words of the UN Charter. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. And those leaders came back to it 3 years later when they adopted the world's most precious human rights testament, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with its hope-filled blueprint for a world in which the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And over the 60 years since, governments have come back to this theme time and time again. The resolutions, the treaties, the conventions, the declarations that they have adopted since then would reach the ceiling here, all promising time and time again to protect human rights. And they've been beautiful words. They've been words that have spoken to us about what it is to be members of this global family, what it is to live our lives in dignity, and what it is to live in community with others. Governments have promised us that no one ever, for any reason, shall be tortured, They have assured us that men and women will live in complete equality, that no one will ever experience discrimination because of their race, their religion, their nationality, their sexual orientation, that all children will have access to free elementary level education, that everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression and to be able to hold their own individual opinions, that there shall be access for all people to basic levels of life-sustaining health care, that no one in times of war shall deliberately attack civilians, and that refugees shall not be sent back to countries where their lives would be at risk. Those are beautiful words. They're fine, fine promises. But we also know, don't we, that the reality is certainly not there. Because we know that we do not yet live in a world where no one is ever tortured, where men and women do live in complete equality, where no Black woman or Muslim man or gay teenager ever experiences discrimination, where children in Toronto and children in a slum neighborhood in Cairo have the same ability to go to school, where no one ever goes to prison because they've written an article criticizing a repressive politician, where access to treatment for life-destroying diseases like HIV/AIDS is equally available to everyone, where bombs never rain down on the homes of ordinary families, and where refugees are always welcome and never sent back to danger. Well, no, we don't yet live in that world. But we can, we must, and we will. And that is all about us. That's all about us as members of this global human family. That is what our full citizenship is all about. It has to be. It absolutely has to be. That's the vision that is at the heart of my own organization, Amnesty International. Last year, we just marked our 50th anniversary. And back in 1961, when it all began, it started small. Great things often do. A British lawyer named Peter Benenson learned about the arrest and imprisonment of two students in Portugal. In 1961, it's not the Portugal you know today. It was a country living under cruel military government. And those two students were arrested and thrown in prison simply because they stood up in a cantina in Lisbon and dared to raise their glasses of wine in a toast to freedom. Well, Peter Benenson was outraged to hear that. But more fundamentally, he was sure that there would be not just a handful, but legions of other people who would share that same sense of outrage and who, as full global citizens, would want to do something about it. And so he set out, he was determined that if he could find a way to harness that, to draw together that collective sense of outrage, couldn't it become a powerful and even irresistible force for change, a force for justice. And he did so. Unambitiously at first, all he hoped was that a few people would write a few letters. But more than 50 years later now, there have been millions upon millions of people who have, yes, written many letters, but they have also sent faxes, they have joined and linked hands around prisons, they have given talks in their schools, they've handed out materials in shopping malls, they've spoken with their members of parliament, they've done interviews, they've added their name to a petition on the internet, they've clicked share on Facebook. And along the way, a global human rights movement has now been born. Because everywhere, in every corner of the world now, women and men and young people clamor for human rights on a daily basis. For their own rights? Yes. for the rights of their friends and their families, of course, but also for the rights of strangers in countries halfway around the world. And in doing so, they've known that they are often taking great risk and putting themselves in great peril. But they have known the much greater risk of staying silent and doing nothing. There's so much to inspire us, and that has inspired us to be part of that global movement, because while these have been years and decades of great human rights tragedies, there have also been some incredibly amazing human rights triumphs. Witness Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia most recently. But going back over the years, the end of the cruel reality of apartheid in South Africa, the dismantling of totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe, the fall of so many military governments in parts of Latin America and Asia. Governments have adopted powerful, important new treaties dealing with incredibly crucial human rights issues like women's equality, the rights of children, the rights of persons living with disabilities, the rights of indigenous peoples, torture, disappearances, and so much more. They have banned landmines. They've agreed to take steps to stop recruiting child soldiers. They've created a powerful new world court that is finally now starting to ensure that the world's worst human rights violators will face justice. And along the way, countless prisoners of conscience who should never have been imprisoned in the first place have been freed, and many others have been spared from torture chambers and death row. Well, all of those triumphs were all about millions of people, millions of voices insisting that it be so. They are the ones, people just like you, who unleashed that change. And that's all phenomenal, that's all tremendous. But we, of course, live in a world with huge, wrenching, daunting human rights challenges still. We think of those parts of the Middle East and North Africa that have not yet seen the promise of justice and liberty. The so many forgotten human rights corners of our world, especially Africa, which never captures the world headlines, rarely makes it onto UN agendas. Somalia's lawlessness, Sudan's many agonies, Eritrea's tyranny, the ongoing sexual violence and injustice that so many women continue to face in Congo. And then what of the tendency, the ongoing insistence of governments to continue to put human rights in the back seat, to put them second to other interests? We see this all the time. We see it with trade and investment. Witness the ways in which so many governments, including Canada, so easily overlook China's terrible human rights record. If only we can sign a few more contracts. Or what about the national security debate? So many wrong-headed wars, laws, and policies which pretend that the route to security somehow lies through torture, through unlawful detention and discrimination. Witness President Obama's failure to live up to his own promise to close that global icon of injustice, Guantanamo Bay, by January 2010. Witness our own government's recent instructions to CSIS, our national spy agency, to go ahead and make use of information obtained under torture if public safety is on the line. Then there's the fact that we continue to make such little headway in dealing with the extreme levels of poverty that haunt the lives of well over 1 billion people in this planet of ours. And the failure to recognize that at its heart, that struggle, that issue, is all about human rights, not about charity. Equally, the fact that 60+ years since the founding of the United Nations, founded on that premise of complete equality between men and women, the pervasive inequality and violence faced by women all over the world continues to be a source of global disgrace. And it plays out for us here in Canada in the continuing agony of what is one of this country's most serious and least understood human rights crises, the alarmingly high levels of violence faced by Aboriginal women right across Canada, which is just one of the many examples of the ways in which the rights of Aboriginal peoples continue to be abrogated and undermined every single day in this country. So yes, there have been those great triumphs, but so much lies ahead of us, and some of it sometimes seems intractable. Does that suggest we give up? We just won't get there? We won't bridge that gap between all of those promises and the reality? Absolutely not. What I say to you is it tells us we need more voices. We need more insistent voices, more united and universal voices, voices that are heard at every turn and every corner, every place of cruelty, every time there's an act of injustice, everywhere that the wretched stink of extreme poverty rears its ugly head. That is what we need. It seems big. It seems bigger than us, seems bigger than me, seems bigger than you. Well, it's not, because all of the great things that have ever been achieved in shoring up human rights protection have been about us, have been about ordinary people insisting it be so, insisting that full citizenship for them and their brothers and sisters be all about human rights. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt once said that when it comes to protecting human rights, the real change happens in what she called the small places. And I think she was so right, because that is where it begins. It begins in how we live our own lives. It begins in how we treat others. And it certainly includes how we choose to use our voices. And there are so many ways for you to do so many ways for us to do so many ways to be involved. Organizations like Amnesty International and others give so many opportunities to use that voice to speak out. And then closer to home in our own neighborhoods, of course, there's volunteering in women's shelters and food banks and so many other places. All of that makes a difference. All of that is about human rights, and all of that is about full citizenship. Because at the very end, friends, it all comes down to this. It's about your voice, and it is about your citizenship, and it is about your rights, it is about their rights, and it is, above all else, about our rights. Thank you.